All right, so another concept that we're going to be talking about is variables. And variables are fundamental to programming. So, what is a variable? A variable allows you to store data and then you can access that data whenever you want. So, one way to think about it is kind of like there's a box and you can put something in that box, some kind of data, and whenever you want to get that data, you know that it's in that box, and so you go ahead and retrieve it. So a question you can ask is, why are variables important? And one way that you can I think we can drive this point home to understand the importance of variables is to think of an example of, let's say we want to run some complex calculation, right? And that complex calculation is going to have a result. And then in the future, for some reason, we're going to run another calculation, but that calculation depends on the first calculation that we made. If we have a way to access the result of the first calculation while we're doing the second calculation, that can be beneficial to us, because then we don't have to run the first calculation again in the future. And so that's where variables can come into play. We can run that first calculation, store that result, and then when it comes, when we need that result in the future for any different, for any reason, instead of running the calculation again, we can just access what's in that variable and then use it in the future calculation. And I'm going to show this in code, what this would look like in a simple example. All right, so let's look at some examples of like what that concept of variables looks like. Let's create a new class. We're going to call this class variables. We're going to open this up. If you remember, BlueJ automatically fills out this information, fills out this stuff by default. We're going to delete this stuff and then write our basics out, which is always going to be public static void main. It has to follow this exact format, or else Java won't recognize it and won't allow us to run our code. Because if you remember, Java looks for this exactly to know where to start and execute our code. So I talked about in the kind of the high level example that maybe we have a calculation that we want to do, a first calculation, and then in the future there's another calculation that depends on the result of the first calculation. So let's actually do this. You'll learn more about how to create your own variables. So just look at the example right now. And let's say for some reason we want to do 2 plus 2. So now first calculation is going to hold the result of 2 plus 2. And then one thing to note, when we do calculations like 2 plus 2 or any kind of calculation, you typically it has to go in, it has to be a part of what Java calls a method, and we'll learn more about that in the future, or it has to be stored in a variable. We can't just go out and write 2 plus 2. We're going to get an error, and as you can see, we're already getting an error. And now let's say we have a second calculation that depends on this first calculation, and we'll call it second calculation. And let's say we want to do 54, and we want to use the first calculation. And because we have the first calculation stored in the variable called first calculation, we can use it. Now, second calculation should be storing the result of 54 plus 4. Remember, we talked about printing out variables, or not printing out variables, but printing out stuff. This is a perfect time where we can use that concept. So we have these two variables, and let's say we want to know what's actually in these variables. We know what they should be in there, but like, how do we confirm that? So we can print these variables out. So we can use this, which is what we use to print things out, and we can put, hey, print out first calculation, and then we'll do the same to print out the second calculation. And if we compile that so we can run it, you can see first calculation was 4, the second calculation is 58. All right, so we'll move on.